This first session, the panel discussion on China, will be facilitated by Andrew Young, Executive Chairman of Plumgrove. Andrew has over 20 years' experience in senior management roles in the Australian grains industry, covering international grain trading, corporate strategy and mergers and acquisitions. Andrew previously held roles including General Manager Strategy and Business Development at the CBH Group, General Manager of Agri and Managing Director of Agri Business for Melbourne-based finance group Austock. Andrew, in his capacity as Executive Chairman, is responsible for corporate strategy and governance. Andrew is also Director of West Pork, one of Australia's largest pork producing operations. He's well credentialed to be handling this panel session. What our panellists don't know is Andrew is also an investigative reporter, so I've turned you in. So over to Andrew.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for making it back after lunch. I know it's very enticing to engage in the networking opportunities that are presented by the conference, but I think the group that we have in front of us and the opportunity for today's panel discussion is very exciting. My job is to facilitate this session by introducing our panel members. The intent is that we will cover a Q&A session up here where I'll have the opportunity to ask some questions and have some discussions with our panel members. And then I would like to throw to the floor for a good proportion of today's discussion. So we have a 45-minute session. I think you've been a little bit apprehensive, to be honest with you, in terms of your questions. So I'd like to encourage you to engage, and to get the most out of this session, it's better to have a panel discussion and an open discussion. So I would encourage you, when it does come to the question time, unless you ask questions, I'll call you out to ask some questions. Now, our panel. Let me introduce our panel. So Lyndon Asser, Senior Commercial Manager with Glencore Agriculture, and Mr. Yebin Lee, more commonly probably known in some circles as Bruce Lee, as our CEO of COFCO International Australia. Will has already been introduced to the audience, so I won't spend some time, but I will go through the rap sheets of our two gentlemen here. Between the two of them, they have between 25 and 30 years each experience in the grain trade in Australia, and particularly focused on the Australian-China relationship. In Lyndon's case, he is President of the Australian Grain Exporters Council, which we heard a little bit about today. He is also a board member of GTA Australia, the Grain Industry Market Access Forum, and a member of a very challenging role in the Australian Grain Industry Discussion Group. Lyndon is somewhat of a journeyman. He is unique in our industry in that he has managed to survive what I would describe as a multitude of ownership changes, corporate restructures and several takeovers within the same organisation, which is testament to his skill set. So Lyndon joined the Australian Barley Board as it was back then in the late 80s. Obviously the ABB went through a corporatisation process, merged with Ausbulk as it was then, corporatised and was taken over by Viterra, and then of course we know was taken over by Glencore. Lyndon survived all that process and has held various roles related to marketing barley in particular in Adelaide, Melbourne, Geneva, Rotterdam, and has returned to Australia after several years overseas in, 2015? So welcome to Lyndon. And now my next guest, Bruce, or Yebin, he joined COFCO in the early 1990s. Yebin has initially been well known in Australia because his early start in Australia was as the procurement manager for COFCO's malt houses. So he was responsible for the acquisition of over 800,000 tonnes of malting barley for COFCO. And a predominant proportion of that, of course, came from Australia. So he was based in Australia for a period. He then spent quite a significant period looking after domestic customers of a number of operations within COFCO, and then he spent a period of time responsible for several operations within COFCO, which included both rice milling, flour milling, feedstuff, oil storage and trading. In 2017, he was handed the responsibility of returning to Australia in the CEO's role of COFCO International, and of course has overseen the process of the integration between NIDERA and COFCO. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you and welcome to our guests. To set the scene, from an Australian perspective, we may or may not know, you may or may not know, that China is in fact Australia's largest grain market. In the last 12 months or so, the trade volume and activity amounts to in excess of $1 billion. And in particular, what's unique about the Chinese relationship with Australia is that it involves a range and multitude of grains. It's not a grain type particular. So we're doing a significant amount of barley, and Lyndon and Yebin will talk a little bit about that. But we're also doing a reasonable amount of wheat, canola, and of course we had two exciting emerging markets here in both sorghum and oats. We will get to talk about the milling industry with Will. Will purposely left aside China in his presentation, so we will get a chance to talk about the wheat markets in China as well. With that, I will start with some questions to our guests. Yebin, if we start with you, maybe to set a bit of a scene for us, as China is now Australia's largest grain market, can you just expand on what has driven this demand from an Australian perspective, and what's the immediate outlook from an Australian perspective?
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Yes, you're right. Actually, grain business is very important between China and Australia. Australia is one of the important origin for Chinese demand, especially on the wheat and barley. But now there's also sorghum and some canola as well. Actually, why the reason? It is several reasons. I think China, we really have a good production of wheat and also some barley as well. But we still need to import because of our quality of wheat is not good enough, as good as Australian one. We really need Australian wheat to fit the demand of the high quality portfolio for the flour mills in China. So especially, for example, for the protein level, Chinese, that is wheat protein is not as high. We need to import the high proteins, and also SW is also good feed, for the flour regime to produce the good high quality of flour to meet the food demand, or the demand for the food industry in China. So that's really because of the quality driven. We need the Australian protein. We need the Australian quality to how to say that, to blend or whatever, to work with our local wheat and also other origin wheat to produce the high quality food in China. That's mean that also, of course, the voyage also very short. Compare with U.S., Canada, or even Argentina. That's our voyage is really short. That means the freight cost also is lower. There's several reasons for them. I think, given the numbers is really happened between our two industries. So we import around in the past 5 or 4 years, China import more than 1 million, 1.3, 1.4 million for the wheat, but barley demand or barley import is increased a lot. In the past, when my time, actually I left the industry, the malting industry for I think 8 years already. My time is only focused on the malting barley and import from Australia, but now it is more on feed. The total demand now, the total import volume last year, maybe because of the harvest here, but it's 6.5 million, for the barley. That's really good number, because given that normal average, production for Australia, the barley product only 8 or to 10 million. So China import 6.5. But of course, that year is really bump harvest. They had 14 million something, 13, 14 million production. Maybe that's part of the reason. So that's, you can see that demand is really increasing from China. So I think that's maybe give us, some background on that. So I hope that this is the demand is still there. Okay, so China and the Australia grain industry, I think, really connected very closely.
So why, obviously that growth in demand is driven by certain aspects. You've mentioned quality.
Yeah.
What other things have Chinese customers turned to Australia, and what do they recognise about Australia as the pluses in terms of that supply base?
Yeah, okay. Actually, give more, I think, more background on that, or more reason driven because of the, that also the reliability. I think, every year China, Australia is produce, the high quality wheat or barley or sorghum, even sometimes, some years maybe not so stable, but really give a reliability, supply and to Chinese demand. And that the industry is, when they have some kind of regime or the portfolio of their raw materials, they don't want to change too much. They want to keep there and as stability of their quality, assurance in some way. So that's really that. For example, the Australian quality is really, have unique, good quality, one of the best in the world. We should be very proud of that because of, so for example, the lower moisture content. So normally for Canadian or European, they have 13.5 or 14%, but you have only 10 or 11. That means of money because there's less moisture, the yield is high, so higher. So then, for example, the purity of variety. You have a very good system to guarantee the pure variety, and also the mixture. So for the the good system here, quality control system here, really give the confidence, for the Chinese buyers or the consumers, to import Australian, grains into Chinese demand, into China. So that is the issue I think is there. So this kind of things together, that's really, I think, that's good potential and good promising for our future, cooperation between Australia and China.
Yebin, the obvious other question to that is that we have the positives, but obviously there are challenges. What challenges do you see from an Australian perspective? What things are we facing in terms of competition, in terms of response and market demand, etc., from a Chinese perspective? Yeah,
I think, yes, we talk about the high quality of Australia, but the challenge also from quality assurance. You cannot guarantee that, 100%. So the challenge also from the quality issues also from Australia. Like the wheat is sometimes also have gluten problems, sometimes also a mixture, sometimes phytosanitary, some snails problem, for example. So this kind of thing is still a good, I think, a challenge, and for the Chinese demand, and also that's from the quality side. I think from the challenge also from, I know that as a business, as normal business, you are only one of the origin, so you also face the competition from Black Sea, from Canada, from US. So that competition is there. The Chinese buyers, they will judge the value of the the Australian wheat and also Canadian wheat or whatever. They will judge whether the money is very worthy to import Australian wheat. The competition is there. That's also another challenge. For example, nowadays, if you have drought situation, your price really up, the other guys is still okay, then your price maybe lose competitiveness. So then the demand will turn to other origin. That's normal, I think, challenge we have. But that the challenge, because of Australia, you are not irrigated enough. China, we have a lot of irrigation in the area, but here is more rely on the, depends on the God. If you have the rains, you have good production, you can good supply. But volatile of the production in some way because of the weather, meaning I think also another challenge, for the business, I think.
Great, thank you. Lyndon, if we move on to maybe start with barley as that core product that has been the basis of that very strong performance last year, is that a trend that you think is going to continue? Is it something that we're going to continue to see in terms of Chinese demand?
Thanks, Andrew. Yes, I think we will see that continue. There will be, as Bruce was saying, it depends on moves in the market, moves in the price, but that demand, we believe, will be pretty solid and will continue on over many years. The feed barley out of Australia was competitively priced against other feed ingredients into China. They've used it, they've liked what they've seen, they've liked the performance of the barley, as Bruce was saying, low moisture, low foreign material, familiar with our trading terms and our shipment expertise. I think there's an intrinsic or core demand that will remain, so that's really good in terms of Australian feed barley. But of course the the overriding feature at the moment is that the global barley balance sheet is the tightest it's been for many, many years, and much tighter than many other products. So barley, with that tight balance sheet, prices are rising significantly, and unfortunately at the moment that our prices are prohibitive to be competitive against local corn. So we'll go into a period where demand and our ability to sell into that southern China feed market will diminish for a while, but I'm very confident we've found a place there for the future.
And that market, that FAQ market that's somewhere in between feed, is that an established market segment now from an Australian perspective, or does that face the same sort of threat regards the feed market as you've just described?
Yeah, no, I would say the FAQ market is much more inelastic. So it's got a core demand from the Chinese maltster. They rely on it. A lot of the attributes in our FAQ are what they're after. Again, low moisture, low foreign material, a reasonable protein, although that is becoming a bit of an issue. So no, that's got a core demand that, and our reputation is second to none. So we're certainly aware there's some other origins that are trying to put FAQ together, but they just don't have the quality and the reliability that we do.
Okay, you've been responsible for a global book, effectively. In the case of Australia's supply to China, what do you see as the threats then in terms of barley? I mean, are we going to see a situation which we've seen in wheat, for example, in Indonesia, as a pet topic, around a threat to Black Sea supply, for example, or other origin supply? Or are there other major threats that we need to be aware of?
I'm very positive for Australian malting barley into China, so I don't see a great number of threats. I think we've got to be on our game. We've got to keep innovating, and we've got to keep evolving and satisfying the market, and our variety development, I think, has turned a corner. We have gone through a period where perhaps we had too many varieties and we were confusing the buyers, but I'm very positive now on the immediate future, where we're going to probably condense into 3 or 4 main varieties, and I think that'll be a very good attribute for our future business into China. Yes, we suffer competition from the Canadians and perhaps a little more from the Black Sea, but Australia has a very solid reputation, and I don't want to say we're bulletproof, but as long as we keep on our game, I think we've got a good market there.
Very good. What about some of these other emerging markets and growth? I know this is potentially not your bread and butter, so to speak, but the emerging and growth markets in canola, in sorghum, in oats, they are quite exciting and have a great deal of potential. What are your thoughts on those?
I think as the Chinese malting market developed into or aided the feed barley market, so our reputation and our performance meant that we could expand into the provision of feed barley. I also see that with these other products, oats and sorghum and canola. So we do receive many inquiries for oats, and it's all on the back of Australia's reputation for food safety, for quality product, reliability. And so I'm quite bullish on those products as well. It's a reputation thing. You have Australian in your offer and you're ahead of the pack immediately. And I'd like to see that the continued relationship between the Chinese government and the Australian government that's led to the zero tariff for wheat and barley exports to China, I'd like to see that expanded to these other products as well, because that's, along with our moisture, the zero tariff means that we're 3% ahead of any other competitor before we even start negotiating, and that's true value, in my
So,
opinion.
so in that free trade agreement and environment, we're doing well. So you're quite positive about the response that we've had in those circumstances.
Yeah.
And given what's going on globally, this sort of global situation, we've done a reasonably good job.
Yes, yeah, with the doors open, I guess we're ducking under the cover of or under the umbrella of the US-China trade issues at the moment. We've got a fantastic government-to-government relationship, and as I said, two of our main products have a zero tariff, and there's a lot of connectivity and a lot of discussion between the quarantine section in China and the equivalent here in Australia.
Very good. Well, if we move on to wheat, you've purposely not said a lot about wheat in your last presentation, thankfully. Can you give us a bit of a context about what China is doing in terms of its import of wheat and what its uses are?
Yeah, thanks. Basically, China's relatively stable in its imports, assuming there isn't a problem. They're buying about 3.5 million tonnes from the traditional origins of Canada, the US and Australia. Probably the Australian wheat's about 1 to 1.5 million. Canada's probably about 1 to 1.5 million, and the US until recently was probably about 1 million. The US wheat will go to probably effectively zero for now, since the imposition of the tariff. With respect to what they specifically buy, China's probably buying about 90% ASW, maybe 10% prime hard. From Canada, it's buying CWRS, probably typically the 13.5 or the 13.8. And then if the US was there, it would be buying dark northern spring, probably about 70% of the total flow, 30% soft white wheat, and occasionally soft red winter. In terms of what they use that for, based on the information I've got, the ASW is largely used for either premium instant noodles or southern mantou, which is the steam bread, or in general, as Bruce said before, it's used to enhance the colour or increase the yield of the grist. So there's most of the time all this imported wheat will be blended with local wheats to differentiate it from a flour mill just using straight local wheat, and that will be to be able to participate in these higher margin, higher value flours. The US spring wheat and the Canadian spring wheat's generally going into sandwich bread or hamburger buns, because as Bruce said, that there is some high protein wheat in Australia, as China, but just not enough to satisfy. And probably the highest margin flour in China is the high protein flour. So if you can lift the protein of the flour they're making, they access that higher margin flour market.
Very good. If you've been involved in the wheat game for 25 years and exposed to that particular market, what's changed? Obviously, you've moved from an AWB type environment where it's very easy from a customer perspective. You've got one person to talk to. What's changed in terms of industry trend and of flows, and maybe a bit of insight into what might happen in the immediate future?
Well, as you say correctly, in the past it was almost a G2G flow. The AWB or the CWB would be dealing directly with COFCO or Syner for those wheat purchases, and I would say between those two companies it was relatively transparent, but to the outside world they didn't really see what was going on with those flows, and I guess depending on what China's requirement was at the time, they'd be coming for that, that 500,000 million tonnes when they needed to. And conversely, when China needed to buy US wheat, then COFCO or Syner would go to the ABCDs of the world and say, I want to buy 500,000 tonnes, because of course if they tried to come with a private inquiry for that, the market would explode. So it was probably more, there was less participants and it was less transparent, but it suited the buyer-seller relationship at the time. And I think AWB and CWB had a fantastic relationship with COFCO and Sinograin at that time. But of course, the market changed. Today, you know, the market is still dominated by COFCO. And I think in general, COFCO are serving themselves, which is only logical. But we have seen the emergence of quite a few private players, and the role of the private players has increased significantly. And you'd say they are looking slightly differently at how they buy those flows. But again, it's how can they compete for those extra margin flowers. And I'd say most of the time those private players are pushing more to buy protein than anything else per se.
Yeah, okay. Just a question without notice, which I like to do to everybody on the... I've warned our panel. There is some confusion about occasionally licence imports around permits or quotas. Is there clarity around that? Is there uncertainty? And I guess that this extends to a question around government policy and the influence of government policy. In particular, you know, the decision to move to more healthy type-based diets and encouraging environmental reductions in poor environmental practices and other things. But in a permit sense, from a wheat sense, has there been any particular changes or trend lines? And is there likely to be any particular changes? Now, that's a panel question, so that's everybody. So I'll invite everybody to make comment if they would like.
Okay, so start from me. Okay. Okay, actually, I think from my side, I cannot see any change.
No change?
Yeah, it's very sustainable, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lyndon, any comment?
I like dealing with China because we do have the odd bump in the road, but I think with the centralised type administration, I think we get clear signals. I think we get some notice about those signals, and they do follow policy. So you will hear about, this is what we're promoting, healthy living, or we're promoting the deep processing of corn in the north. And when they say they're going to do something, they do something. So that predictability and that, I guess, certainty aids trade, because you feel much more comfortable and confident of putting trades on, and you can see the direction of their policy, and you can see how that relates to your activities. So I do enjoy that, and you know, that can be contrasted. I won't mention other countries, but it can easily be compared to the policy changes you see from other destinations.
Will, any comment you want to add, or are you happy to leave it at that?
I'd be interesting if Bruce can comment whether I'm right or not. The sort of unwritten rule is that the TRQ for China was 9.5, 9.6 million tonnes, but in reality we never see that. And the comment about stability is correct. We're normally seeing about 3.5 million tonnes. So I think what Bruce said was correct, it's stable. I don't know what would be the influencing factor to increase that 3.5, considering 9.6 is theoretically the max, but I don't know if you've got any comments on that, Bruce?
No, actually, I think that's really market decision. You know, it depends on the market demand. Yeah, you have the availability there, but you don't need to utilize it full because the demand may be not there. So that's really depends on the market, I think.
Okay. Well, putting that aside, Will, what other challenges have we got as Australia, if you like, in gaining a bigger market share? Because it does appear that there will be opportunities from global circumstance, although we are affected by drought. What are our challenges in terms of trying to meet or generate greater market share from the Chinese market?
Yeah, well, I think if you noticed on the presentation I made earlier that I left China at 3.5, and in the 2031 I put question mark. The trend that was observed, that's being observed with the growing middle class, you'd also say that's the same in China. So, as Bruce just highlighted, if there is a growing demand for that higher quality products and those wheats are not grown in China, by default, that should increase the demand for higher quality wheat to be imported. I would say the biggest challenge for Australia is that it's going to be very difficult, maybe even impossible, to produce the high protein wheat that China wants in the quantities it may need, because Canada and the US can serve that much more easily because it's part of their bread and butter. So I think the best hope probably for Australia is that the demand for ASW, or perhaps a new market opens up for Australian hard for noodles or something, that may be the way that Australia can increase into the market.
Okay. All right, very good. I think it's an opportune time to maybe ask you to participate and put some questions to our panel. There are, I believe, a couple of microphones that will be floating around. So would anybody in particular, can you just, if you do ask a question, can you introduce yourself and your organisation? Thank you. So we have a couple here at the back.
Matthew Murphy from Solvay. Just interested in the panel's thoughts on staying on China with food security being number one, and their strategy potentially to acquire key agriculture land around the world, Australia, Brazil and others, and how that potentially affects the balance sheet, the trade, who actually owns that commodity, that grain. Is it the country of origin or is it China? Does that continue into the future, or, yeah, just interested in your thoughts.
Okay, so I'll take it as a general question on investment as well, gentlemen. So obviously foreign investment to begin with, and then in particular Chinese investment in agriculture or in general. So everybody welcome to comment.
Oh, maybe I'll start.
Yeah.
I don't see the question as exclusively China. I know that's because I think that we've seen around the world, whether it's international companies participating to be able to trade that commodity, to access that margin flow. We're seeing the Middle East investing in Canada, in other places to get their own food security. So I think we would see Chinese multinational companies doing exactly the same. So I think that all countries that have some sort of either food deficit or requirement for imported grains are going to want to participate down that value chain. So I think that's relatively normal and it's happening.
Yebin, I know it's a difficult, put you in a difficult position. Do you have any comment?
No, I actually no further comment. I quite agree with Will's comment. It's not only China. I think the same thing. With multinational companies that do these kind of things. China, of course, food security is really, because we have a large population, people pay more concerns about the food security. Maybe that's only the differentiation or different, situation from China. But more or less, I think food security, of course, is we need to pay attention to that. But we, of course, China, I think we do just the normal way with other guys, the same thing. Nothing special, I think, from Chinese side.
Okay. Lyndon?
Just a comment. A recent trip I made to China in March, one of the messages that I brought home after meeting some of their authorities there was that they've and this is what I was talking about before, that they tend to follow their change in policy. They were spent some time telling us about they don't see food security as being self-sufficiency anymore. So I see that from a trading environment as a very positive thing. So they're very concerned about food security, but it doesn't necessarily mean, or the result of that is that they must be self-sufficient. So that's very positive. As for foreign ownership of production units anywhere, you often hear in my experience, you often hear stories, yes, they're going to buy the farm and they're going to export it exclusively to that particular destination. And in my experience, that rarely happens because it's a trading enterprise, really. And so that production, there'll be a local production problem, and they'll be incentivised to sell it to their neighbour. They'll be incentivised to sell it to another destination rather than the destination that owns that productive unit. So it works against economics that come what may, or whatever crop you produce, it's going to end up in the one destination. So a lot of people talk about that, but in reality, I don't think it happens very often.
Thanks, Lyndon. Pat?
Hi, Pat O'Shannessy, GTA. Just following on Lyndon, and a question for the panel, I think one of the things that we've heard from China is about changing policy in terms of land use and into environmental issues and so forth. So the expectation to see a change in what's cropped and where, and if, getting to Lyndon's point about food security doesn't mean producing it all yourself anymore. If there was to be a reduction in the Chinese wheat crop, where do you think they would fill the gap in terms of origin and type of wheat?
I think I'll put that to all the panel, maybe Will or Lyndon.
Well, I guess it's going to be the order of magnitude. That depends where they go for that. I'd be surprised if there was a massive drop in Chinese wheat production. You'd say that if you take current policies in recent years, there's definitely been a reaction from the government in response to any deficit or surplus, corn being an example. But from my understanding, wheat and rice are strategic, so they'll probably be maintained because of the trade war. I believe there will be encouragement to grow more soybeans. How much can actually be grown? I don't know. I mean, but I would imagine we will see significant increase in soybeans. If let's say there was a policy, let's say this soybean ate into wheat production areas, then I would have thought they will look to replace the Chinese equivalent wheat in the beginning, so probably more like soft red winter or even Black Sea if phyto issues could be overcome. I wouldn't think it would be a massive growth in demand for spring wheat or whatever. So I think that if it's to replace the mass market wheat, I think it'd be looking for what's the cheapest safe alternative to the local crop, which in recent years has been soft red winter or occasionally ASW, but you would think nowadays it's going to be soft red winter or perhaps a G2D sort of Russian arrangement, maybe even a land movement of wheat from Russia into China from areas which don't work to the traditional export channels.
Gentlemen, anything to add?
Not really. I guess if we had to learn from history, the recent embracing of Australian feed barley that did occur relatively seamlessly. If the policy was to move away from local corn production to beans and therefore created a feed shortage, I think Australia would be well placed. Obviously, we've got finite exports, so in a quantum of 240 million tonne of corn demand, an extra 2 or 3 million tonne of Australian feed barley, apologies for talking barley, but is small, but I have no fear it would move into China very easily.
Okay, question out the back, Neil.
Neil Wandle, a farmer and small exporter of Estons, WA. I was actually had the potential to be in China last week, and our customers up there are all asking, why do you quote us in US? Can we do direct in the local currency? I'm just wondering what percentage of Australian grain is sold direct through the RMB, considering their currency is very volatile at the moment against the US, and so is ours. So is the potential for more direct trade direct with the RMB?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah, very interesting. It's really beyond my area.
Yeah,
It's a currency, I think, is big topic, yeah. So I don't...
Anybody doing anything outside of USD?
No.
Well, I think that the only time it's really occurring today is if organisations have a local China structure, because there is licences available to trade domestically in China. So I think that today some local distribution does occur in RMB, so i.e. the international company imports it in US dollars, then sells it in RMB locally, and if it's an international company, they can use various hedging tools to manage that RMB exposure, but it's limited, it's small today.
Yeah, okay, very good.
But I think also that the Chinese private importers are doing that on a fairly large scale. So they will buy from the international trade houses, then do the local distribution, which is a big part of what they do, gathering together quota and selling domestically.
They must have a different risk management committee than most of us. Any other questions from the floor? Maybe one or two to finish off on. Bruce, the malt industry in China has expanded rapidly over the last 10 years, and we've seen a significant amount of increase, driven by consumptive demand, of course. Do you see any change to that, or do you see it stagnating a little, or do you see the same sort of growth curve that we've seen?
Yeah, actually, yes, yeah, Andrew, I think, the beer industry in China really increased in the past 10 or 15 years, is dramatically increased. But I have to say that now really stop at the peak. I mean, now the beer industry in China is really a little bit down, but the structure, the quality structure really changed. I mean, more high premium quality beer, like a craft beer, is really getting more and more shares in there. And in the past, we call our Chinese beer is barley water, you know. But nowadays, the quality really improved a lot. That means we use more malt and also less adjuncts and also more hops. So that, okay, the structure really changed, but the production itself is really a little bit, is on the peak, I think, is a little bit down as well. So the malt industry is really, you know, cope with the, you know, the beer industry increase. Then the malt industry capacity really increased in the past 20 or 15 years. Like COFCO, you know, we started from one more plant, but now we have 3 now. We want to build another one. So the total capacity already, you know, now gained, you know, 800 or even to 1 million maybe in the future. So that's kind of things really happen. But I think maybe in the past, in the next near future, the demand should be keep there, not like before increase a lot, keep there and maybe a little bit increase just because of the quality change, quality structure change, or the more demand for the malt, less adjuncts. Thank you.
Okay. Just one final comment and question. I guess there is one down the end. Tess?
Do you see that the type of adjunct that they're using is going to change? And if it does, what would make that change?
Sorry. The type of adjunct?
Yeah.
Do you see that changing?
Yeah, that's right. The adjuncts, you know, usually we use, how to say that? The adjuncts we use the corn, syrup, all these things, the adjunct, rice even, you know. But now, it really changed because of the price. You know, why they use adjuncts? Because they want to have less cost. And also the quality is not big concern. They can utilize some percentage to lower the cost with use the adjuncts. But actually, of course, everyone knows that the high quality malt, high quality beer really is all malt. If you utilize 100% malt, that quality should be premier than the adjuncts. But the change is that because of the adjuncts price really high, like the rice price in China is not cheap now. And also, you know, we got also some kind of alternative, just like Lyndon mentioned that, you know, if we can utilize some kind of between like FAQ, you know, then you can still help to change these kind of things. Yeah.
One final question, and maybe to wrap it up. The industry here is considering the industry good function as we describe it, and that is really how we're servicing the market in terms of responding to particular market trends, demands, quality issues that we're dealing with, non-tariff issues and other things. Can I ask the panel, is there any, are we servicing the market like we should be servicing the market, and is there opportunities for us to expand that through some sort of development of industry good function in a more formal sense? And I notice that Richard Simonitis, of course, is over in the corner. I'm going to put Richard on the spot in a minute and maybe just talk about what work is being done by organisations like AGIC maybe in terms of the Chinese market. But before I do that, from a panel perspective, is there any comments or questions or comment about that in terms of that?
The industry has got together over the last couple of years, and the sum of that discussion has been that, yes, we're not coordinated in the international market, that we do need some type of industry good company or structure that can put a single voice to certain issues, not all issues. Certainly trade and market access and the quality aspect of the grains that we're producing. So yeah, the consensus was we're uncoordinated, we're inefficient, and that's all part of the discussion group and the industry good company that you've probably heard about. That's where we're heading, and you know, I see that in my day-to-day activities, that with the number of travellers to China, the number of different presentations from different organisations, we do not look like a coordinated team.
Interesting. Okay. Richard, have you got any comments about the work that AGIC in particular is doing up in China, or particularly focused on those products?
Yeah, sure, Andrew. I'm happy to give an update. I would concur with what Lyndon just said, but really across all of the commodities, we're working either where there's a threat or an opportunity, really. Some market maintenance work, so the seminar that Mary conducted 4 weeks ago that was, you know, well supported with 5 trading houses up there, meeting 80 customers in Beijing and 55 in Guangzhou. So, you know, that's more a maintenance type activity. But on the research side, I guess with threats, there's a clear market signal about low protein in Australian malting barley. So we could ask the grower side to respond to that, which would be costly and probably wouldn't be rewarded by the market. We can ask the breeders to do something about efficiency over time, but that'll take 7 to 10 years. So we're saying, well, what's the research opportunity? And that is to, with the knowledge that more than half of the protein comes out the back end of the factory, how can we identify the enzymes that can maybe snip that up into smaller pieces and make more of what's already there available, rather than trying to incur extra cost to grow more. On the wheat side, we're working with a significant milling company up there, understanding it's a highly segmented market and just demonstrating that in noodles, ASW at the bottom end, APW in the middle, AH at the premium end of the market, but the Australian functionality, you know, and there's a clear value proposition around milling yield and functionality that makes it worthwhile buying those products from Australia if you're a noodle manufacturer. So, you know, that's a real opportunity going forwards. I think, you know, Will's alluded to that. In oats, we collaborate with Shaanxi University, so at the premium end of the market, there's oat flour added to wheat flour to make the Chinese dry salted noodle. We've been benchmarking Australian varieties against Chinese varieties, and you know, Chinese varieties can get to about 30% inclusion of oat flour into the noodle. With Australian varieties, we're up over 50% now, so a healthier product aimed at the top end of the market. And there's a lot of work around health and nutrition, so taking the Grains and Legumes Nutrition Council up there and working with the government. There's a clear understanding around the health benefits of whole grains in China, and a strong push by the government to get their population back to less processed foods. So both on as far as the system goes, but also that there's a real advantage in buying white wheat out of Australia if you're moving towards whole grain products. So there's more than that, but they're the key line ones. So.
Great. All right. Thanks, Richard. Our time's up. Thank you very much for, first of all, our panel members. So I'd like you to put your hands together and thank Yebin, Lyndon and Will.